Hello viewers, welcome back for my review of the second season of Golden Kamuy. I feel like I've been saying this a lot lately, but I wasn't sure where to start in writing this review, in part because Golden Kamuy became very character-driven this season. It's always a bit easier to organize reviews for shows that are more story-driven, but also because I finished that last episode and just couldn't sit still for several hours afterwards. Everyone I've talked to who loves this series usually mentions that they feel it's underrated, or at least underappreciated in the greater anime community. And I get it now. I am officially on that bandwagon. Just everything about it got so good in Season 2. But I also think this season immediately made it pretty clear why this series isn't exactly made for a widespread, mainstream sort of popularity. Golden Kamuy started to feel like a series that got away with something. It was always a little crude, a little strange. Season 2 felt like the creators came off of Season 1, saw it all went over fine, and said, great, let's crank it up to 11 then. We open with all our different parties converging on the home of a taxidermist of questionable mental health who's rumored to work in human skins. Unfortunately for pretty much everyone, Lieutenant Tsurumi gets to him first and convinces him to make a set of skins with fake tattoos to make the hunt just a little bit harder for everyone else. To be honest, this fake skin plotline hasn't actually been of much consequence yet. Tsurumi has the skins but hasn't tried anything with them, and even when he does, everyone else figured out what he was scheming almost immediately. The effect this early plotline will have on the greater story has yet to be seen. It highlighted something else, though. For most of this batch of 12 episodes, this really felt like it was Tsurumi's season. Not even in the sense that we spend more time with him than anyone else, but that nearly everyone we do spend time with, their stories always seem to loop back around to him. I definitely got a clearer picture of his influence over the 7th, starting right in with episode 1, watching him cheer on the taxidermist as he modeled all his skin outfits, basking in the glory of finding the first person to ever support his hobby. Tsurumi's men regard him with a mix of hero worship and flat-out lust. He's an interesting one, though. I don't hate him, actually. Not as of right now, anyway. He's manipulative for sure, but he doesn't exactly feel like a liar to me. We already know he's of questionable mental health himself, and I totally believe his applause for the skin suits was at least a little genuine. But he's got all the marks of a master manipulator. He definitely knows vulnerability when he sees it, and knows how to use that to win people over. But I also believe that he does want his men to prosper and be happy, just so long as that happiness can be found within the empire he's building. There's also no doubt that he can be absolutely ruthless to anyone who betrays him, and I expect I'll be seeing a lot more of that in the future, because he's already picked wrong at least twice. I suspect 3 times. We see more of a man this season named Tsukishima who doesn't seem to have drunk the Kool-Aid quite as deeply as the others. I can't make any further assessments until I see more of him in Season 3, though. But for now, we're going to bounce back to 2 characters that were actually introduced last season. I didn't talk about either of them, because I honestly didn't think they'd still have a place in the story this far in, but they both came back and played pretty big roles in Season 2. First is Ogata, a sniper who seems to have officially deserted the 7th as of this season, but it's worth noting that his motivations were always a little sketchy. He's actually the first other soldier Sugimoto runs into back in Season 1, and the reason he gets to be on Tsurumi's radar. But Tsurumi didn't actually know why Ogata was following him that day, so he's had his own agenda from the start, and I still haven't pieced together exactly what that is as of Season 2. Initially, he seems to have teamed up with Hijikata now. I suppose that's one big immediate effect of the early fake skin plotline. It brings the other 2 groups together. Sugimoto and his friends are allied with Hijikata and his group for most of Season 2. Ogata is the kind of character I found myself making excuses for, if we're being totally honest. You ever find yourself endeared to a character who really doesn't have much rightfully endearing about them? That's where I'm at with Ogata. Part of it was his skill. He's ruthless and competent, and it was great having a sniper on our side for a while. He was like MVP of this team for most of the season. But mostly, I've seen people joke that Golden Kamuy is really a cooking show masquerading as this brutal treasure hunt war story, and they're kind of right sometimes. A lot of the time, the other characters would be in the middle of something big and important, and then we'd flash to Sugimoto and Ashera, and they'd just be strolling through the forest, Ashera teaching him new recipes. But this series has some great moments revolving around people putting aside their differences and coming together to share a meal. It's really heartwarming, especially this season when most of the people we're with can't be trusted for one reason or another. With Ogata specifically, these relaxed, lighthearted moments gave him this awkward, stick-in-the-mud vibe. Frankly, it was sweet to see the others work so hard to include him and try to get him to let his guard down. That's probably where this fondness really stems from, wanting to see their kindness rewarded. But I also really loved the tale of his upbringing. Ogata is the illegitimate son of a well-respected military general, who abandoned Ogata's mother, who he was having an affair with, when another son was born to his wife. In response, Ogata's mom went a little crazy. Not in, like, a dramatic way, more in a delusional one. What we see in his memories is a woman who's just a step above comatose, just going through the motions of whatever she thinks will bring his father back, namely cooking his favorite meal, day after day. Remember how I said Ogata was a character I was tempted to make excuses for? It's not a backstory that paints him in a particularly sympathetic light. First, he poisons his mother, wondering if her death will finally bring his father back to them. And yeah, that's fucked up on all sides. He was young when he did it, too. Maybe 10, but definitely old enough to understand death, and that makes it even more disturbing. But also, if they were looking for someone predisposed to sympathy for a character who grew up a little twisted because of their experience with a mentally ill parent, they found me. I am the target audience. I'm more sad for the child who continuously failed to get his mother to prioritize him over the man who left them than I am disturbed by the fact that this is basically an origin story for a serial killer. Because his father doesn't come back, of course, and Ogata grows up to join the military himself, where he meets his half-brother, who he also kills, taking advantage of the chaos of one of the battlefields during the war, which still doesn't lead to his father acknowledging the one son he has left, so he finally has that heart-to-heart with Lieutenant General Hanazawa, while he kills him, too. But back to that in a minute. I think what I really loved about this backstory episode was the storytelling. Ogata is an almost impenetrably stoic character, and he narrates the whole tale in his usual straightforward way, but the emotions behind all his decisions still came through clearly, with the brother especially. He gets like a total of 2 or 3 still shots of screen time, but you still really get a sense of how good-natured and naive he was, in comparison to how much Ogata suffered for their shared heritage. His line about how he'd always wanted a brother was a real slap in the face. Maybe not enough to justify killing him, but... And their father wasn't just any military leader. He's the man who used to lead the 7th, bringing this story back around to Tsurumi once more. They disguised his murder to look like a suicide. Ogata got his revenge, and Tsurumi got to take over. But in that same concise way, Ogata also makes it clear that he sees Tsurumi's manipulation for what it is, so it comes across more like they were using each other. The other defector from the 7th was a little more loyal, at least at first. Tanigaki is a man from a family of Matagi, or traditional hunters from the mountains, Groups of Mitagi actually still exist today, but their methods date back to an era before guns were introduced to Japan, so their ways were mostly a thing of the past, even in the early 1900s when this story is set. But this upbringing means Tanigaki is another one with no shortage of survival skills. The Mitagi actually have quite a bit in common with the Ainu, which makes his story more fitting than I could appreciate in Season 1. He was part of one of the first groups from the 7th who went after Sugimoto and Ashera. The other 3 were killed by a bear, so Tanigaki got off pretty easily, just stranded in the woods with a broken leg. Later, Tsurumi's men would assume he killed these 3 himself, but he was already planning to leave before he was officially cast out. I don't want to go into too much detail with his backstory, but he basically had a falling out with his family before leaving to join the army. Now he feels like he can't return, especially because his mother died while he was away at war, before he got a chance to patch up their relationship. So of course he'd be pulled in by Tsurumi, champion of giving soldiers with broken families a new home. But that's not really the focal point of his story. While stranded in the mountains, Tanigaki is taken in by a hunter, who's actually one of the tattooed prisoners, but that's a tale for another time. This man gets him back in touch with his heritage, and would have left him ready to return home, I think, except association with him brings him back into contact with the main characters, too, earning him another injury and a stay in Ashera's village to recuperate. His time with the Ainu, how welcoming they were, how they were willing to nurse a total stranger back to health, really has an impact on him. So in Season 2, he sets out to join our main characters to help Ashera achieve her goals, if only so he can bring her back home safely to repay her grandmother. There are 2 major elements to Tanigaki's story for me. One is that he starts up a surprisingly serious romance with a fortune teller who's also traveling with them, because she has a history with Ashera's father. She was another one I was never sure if I could trust, and when that element is first introduced, it looked almost like it was just going to be a joke or a cover story. And then it started to take on this really genuine, heartfelt feel. Even when it became clear that Inkarmat had a thing for Ashera's father, they don't drag that out for the sake of drama. I don't know why it surprised me so much. Maybe just because it's a fairly ordinary storyline, and this series has already taught me to always expect the craziest thing possible to happen next. But a serious, straightforward romance between any of the characters was not on my bingo card of things I thought I might see in Season 2. But I didn't dislike it by any means. Tanigaki really grew on me this season. I wouldn't say he's particularly interesting compared to a lot of the other members of this group, but he's perfectly likable. He's kind and earnest. He just comes across as a good guy, plain and simple. And I loved his loyalty to the Ainu who took him in. The way the twists and turns of this adventure allowed him to find himself again. That's the second element, the one that really highlighted a big theme in this tale: recovery. Like Tsurumi, it felt like we didn't see a ton of Sugimoto this season, but so many of the other characters' stories looped back around to reflect something about him. I mentioned in my review for Season 1 that I loved how open he was to learning all the Ainu customs and just everything Ashera tried to teach him. I saw it through the lens of setting up the plot, how that quality helped introduce the story and this world. This season, I really looked back and felt how much this new friendship is helping in his own recovery journey. I mean, I don't think they had a word for it in 1906, but Sugimoto pretty clearly has PTSD. I won't call it the best scene in the whole season, because the final episode was pretty amazing from start to finish, but one of my favorite scenes came at the end of episode 5, when Ashera and Sugimoto are huddled up together, waiting for a storm to pass. A minor character they'd been working with had been killed earlier in the episode, and Ashera asked him if it had been quick, if he'd suffered. And Sugimoto told her basically not to worry, because the character in question was a bad person, and so he wouldn't feel pain the same way ordinary people do. And she bristles at first, thinking he's coddling her because she's young, that he's treating her like a child. But it turns into this really poignant reflection on what it takes to survive a war emotionally, the lies a person has to tell themselves to live with killing others, day after day. I also mentioned in my review for the first season that the prisoners all tend to be unhinged in some way, and Sugimoto was really good at meeting them on their level, relating to that insanity or obsessiveness. But if there was one place there was consistently a disconnect, it was with the ones who romanticized murder in any way. He takes his transgressions and the damage he thinks it's done to his soul very seriously. I definitely didn't appreciate how seriously at the start. It's only the first or second episode where he formally teams up with a Sherpa and promises her he'll take care of the darker parts of this venture, on account of how he's already lost any chance he had of making it into heaven. And at the time, it kinda just comes across as a cool one-liner. But the longer I spent with this character, listening to the somber way he talks about the war and his own survival, seeing bits and pieces of the nightmares he's haunted by, he seems to genuinely believe he's a bad person, or at least that the things he's done can't be redeemed. Not in an angsty, mopey way, but that only makes it more sad, honestly, because I feel like anyone who's paying attention can see he's not bad at all. Kindness comes so naturally to Sugimoto. This season introduced a simultaneous hope and fear in him, the possibility that one day he'll be able to return to the person he was before the war. It certainly shed some things in a new light for me. I can't stress enough how real Sugimoto felt. He has serious moments, he has fun, goofy moments, he has badass moments, but he's never over the top in a cartoony way. So yeah, he's not the edgy character, caught up too much in his own darkness, but he's also not your typical super optimistic, sunshine incarnate main protagonist either. He's appropriately suspicious most of the time. So it surprised me a bit how little resistance there was to travel alongside and team up with Hichikata's group, some of whom had already tried to kill him more than once. That capacity for forgiveness feels like another important puzzle piece to his character. Back to that scene in episode 5, he tells a Sherpa that maybe some of the soldiers who survived were able to go home and reclaim their old lives and their past selves, but the rest are still lost, their hearts stuck on the battlefield. And then we get a nice little montage of basically every named soldier we know. And then it all falls into place, because he can't hope for forgiveness or redemption for himself, but then be the one to deny it for the others. After all, he doesn't really know them or their stories, who they might have been just a year or two ago. This season did some really amazing things for the character development. I feel like I saw almost everyone in a new light at some point, and could theorize about how that new information possibly affects their motivations and senses of self for at least another hour. But we did also get some major plot developments this season too. Spoiler warning from here to the end if anyone needs it, because I have to talk about that last episode. We do make it into Abashiri prison and meet Nopperabo by the end of the season, and everything falls apart pretty immediately as soon as they get inside, those tenuous alliances breaking down, but we'll save the story stuff for the end and stick with the character revelations for now. Ashera is as competent as ever, but she really started to feel like the child she doesn't want to be seen as this season. Not just because she's traveling with all these giant muscled men and looks almost comically small when she's standing amongst them, but because she's also found something to haunt her since last season. She's got a simultaneous hope and fear of her own, the possibility that her father's still alive, but also what it'll do to her perception of him if he really is Nopperabo. The scene where her worst fears are confirmed is really something special, not least of all for how it highlights Sugimoto and Ashera's relationship. Their loyalty to and heartfelt honesty with each other is one of my favorite parts of the series. It got spelled out pretty clearly early on, when the group first meets up with Hijikata, who offers to pay Sugimoto for the skins he's already collected. What he offers would be more than enough to cover the surgery, his original motivation, but Sugimoto announces that his priorities have changed now, or at least widened. His mission won't be over until he gets Ashera the answers, and possibly revenge, she's looking for. And he was equally betrayed to learn Noparabo really was her father. I'm gonna be honest, I don't feel like I've totally grasped what Noparabo's faction's grand designs were yet. He was setting up the Ainu for a war with the Japanese for some reason. More independence and control of the land, maybe? That's a question for another time. What was really striking about this confrontation was how righteously furious Sugimoto was to learn he'd been planning for Ashera to lead this charge. Suddenly, all her childhood memories of their time spent hunting in the mountains together take on a darker tinge. He wasn't just promoting her independence and making sure she could take care of herself. He was training her for battle. And Sugimoto, who's worked so hard to make sure she doesn't have to carry the burdens he has, really goes off on him for it, and it's beautiful. And it does get through to him, at least a little. Noparabo warms up to Sugimoto just enough to reveal that he wasn't the one who killed the Ainu to steal the gold, right before Ogata kills him. He shoots Sugimoto too, though it goes through the edge of his skull at just the right angle so that he survives it. But the new teams at the end of the season are a real mess. Hijikata, who was around this season, I just didn't have much reason to talk about him, had his own little plotline with the warden who was obsessed with him. Once that's taken care of, he finds the warden's stash of information on all the escaped prisoners, so he doesn't have much of a team anymore, but he's hardly worse off for it. Sugimoto, and Tanigaki, were saved by Tsurumi. Interestingly, they don't feel like his prisoners, it just feels like a new alliance. At least, they're relying on his resources to go after Ashera, who is with Shiraishi, who Sugimoto entrusted to look after her, but he's never exactly been competent enough to feel reliable. Ogata, who told her that Sugimoto is dead, but not that he's the one who shot him, and Kiroranke, the old friend of her father's who's suspicious for more reasons than I can even count. Season 2 ends with everyone heading to Karafuto, where Noparabo was going before he was captured, all those years ago. Would you believe that when I first started writing this review, I thought it would be on the shorter side? And then I let everything I'd learned about the characters this season sit with me a little longer, and here we are. It is no exaggeration to say this series has started consuming all my thoughts. Just a few more disjointed points I had before I finally wrap this up. I was really disappointed that they've already killed off Noparabo. In part because I knew it was Ogata the second it happened. Who else could have made that shot? And I knew from the start that he couldn't be trusted, but I knew it wasn't wise, but I let him grow on me. I mentioned recovery as a pretty big overall theme in this series. A redemption for Ogata feels like a real long shot, but for now, I can still dream. But it's also disappointing because there was still so much I wanted to learn about Noparabo, and now we've lost our chance of getting any of that information firsthand. Our potential sources are Ashera, who was really young in all her memories and understandably biased, Inkarmat, who was also pretty young when they traveled together and may have never even known the real him, or Kiroranke, who I do not trust. I just feel like anything he shares is going to come with his own agenda attached. On another note, I'd really like to get more of Sugimoto's backstory too. I love his connection with Ashera, but I feel pretty disconnected from his original motivations for doing this. We know almost nothing about the friend he lost or the wife. I'd really like the story to humanize them a bit. I think this show has proven that I can't possibly predict what it will do next, but that's a little of what I'm hoping to see. I'm in deep now. I can't wait to see where this goes. Thank you for watching.